Howdy y'all, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for being here. Today we're going to get back into the Old World series where we take a look at some of the oldest and most important cities across the world from pre-1900. And today our focus will be Hartford, Connecticut. Now, Hartford has a very long history, and it is one of the most important and well-documented histories, at least when we talk about the early history of Hartford, of any city in the United States of America. And what I found very interesting when I read through a little bit about the history of Hartford is that there are many gaps in the history, that we have long periods of time where we don't have a lot written about what was going on in this city, although according to the population numbers and the buildings that we see being constructed, we can certainly surmise that there was a lot going on in this city. And we only have a handful of different architects that are attributed to all of these amazing buildings that I'm about to show you. So let's just get into it. We're going to look through about 130 different images of Old World Hartford, Connecticut, and I'm briefly going to go over what the current narrative has to say about the history of this beautiful place. Hartford was originally occupied mainly by Podunk Native Americans, and Podunk is an Algonquin word meaning where you sink in the mire, or simply boggy place. Now, the Podunk people called their homeland Nawashi, meaning between rivers, referring to Hartford's location between the Park River and the Connecticut River. The Podunk had three main bands to their tribe, and the most influential was the Scantycook, whose leader, known as Foxen or Poxen, was a key benefactor in communication with other native nations, including the Mohegan, and later went on to be a key witness to land deed signings between the native nations and early settlers. You can find this name of Foxen or Poxen repeatedly in many of the early historical records from the 1600s. The Dutch from New Amsterdam, which is now New York City, set up trade in Hartford as early as 1623, following Adrian Block's exploration in 1614. The Dutch built Fort Good Hope in modern-day Hartford, expanding the New Netherland colony. By 1654, however, it is written that this fort was completely abandoned. And it also has it written in the narrative that in 1635 is the time when the first British settlers arrived, and they were led by Pastor Thomas Hooker and John Haynes, who would go on to be the first governor of Connecticut. Now, when they arrived, it's written that they named this land Newtown, and they changed the name to Hartford a few years later. Now, Pastor Thomas Hooker wrote the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which was a document on how Connecticut should be ruled. And basically, the principle behind this paper or this document was that Connecticut should be governed by the order of the people and not by the order of God. And many historians believe that Hooker's writing had great influence on the later U.S. Constitution and many of its founding principles. Now, this is where the history gets really interesting, because according to the population numbers and even some of the old depictions and photographs that I could find, obviously Hartford grew a lot during the 1700s. However, on this official page of the history of Hartford, there is really nothing written about Hartford in the 1700s. Nothing written during the American Revolution, and nothing about the wars and skirmishes and things like that that would follow. Obviously, you can see Hartford really prospered at the time, and we see these huge buildings being built, but there are no major events talked about. So I found that to be really interesting. And the next portion of the history of Hartford that's discussed on this page is an event that occurred on December 15th of 1814. December the 15th, 1814. On this date, the Hartford Convention was held, and this was a convention, basically a meeting of all the states in New England. They each sent a delegation to meet in Hartford, Connecticut, and this was to discuss secession from the United States of America. Now, the reason for this was because the entire region of New England was staunchly abolitionist, and Hartford was one of the most well-known abolitionist cities in the United States of America. In 1860, the first Wide Awakes appeared in Hartford, and these were abolitionist supporters of Abraham Lincoln, who held massive organized events and demonstrations accompanied by food and music, which would basically become the first instance of what is now in modern times known as political campaigning. So I found that to be very interesting. For a long period of history, even the whole way back to the early 1800s, we have the land of Hartford being known for its support of the freed man. And I found that really interesting, really inspirational, and probably lends to some of this awesome architecture that we see in this melting pot city of Hartford. And this is where we get to another large gap in the history of Hartford, Connecticut. Now, I know obviously there were many things that occurred, and I could get into those details here, just have to do a little digging. But what I found really interesting is a lot of these historical pages that are said to be set up by the historical societies of these areas are really leaving out long time periods where supposedly many of these massive and intricate buildings are built. And it's no different when you look at this official history page of Hartford, Connecticut. Another thing that I found interesting was the amount of buildings that have this very similar architecture. Now, they say after the Civil War, the railway system really expanded throughout Hartford. And at the same time, we have these really unique buildings that are popping up all throughout the city. And I wanted to dive into the who, the what, the when, the why, the how, and look at some blueprints of these buildings, but I found them really hard to come by. So what I wanted to do is just show you a couple of photographs of these buildings that have really similar construction, that are said to have been built decades from one another. So these were not constructed all at the same time. This is not one build. Yet if you look at these buildings, not only are they built with basically the same type of red brick, even down to the size of the brick, but we'll find that the angle or the apex that is created by the turret on top is basically the same in a lot of these buildings. And what I mean is, if you take the angle that is created by the slope of the building, you can find that it's really similar in all of these old world, or at least a handful of these old world buildings that were built in Hartford. So while they're not built at the same time, according to the current narrative, they were built with this harmony of construction in mind, where they would all appear to go hand in hand with one another. And I found that really interesting. That is something that we would never see in a modern day city. And more likely you would see old world buildings like this that appear and don't really fit the rest of the buildings around them. But you will find that many of the oldest buildings in Hartford were actually very harmonious with one another. And I just found it interesting that the narrative doesn't really talk about this. It doesn't talk about the expansion of this city. They just give us the numbers of the population and say that the city grew. But there's nothing about what Hartford did during World War I, or what role Hartford played during World War II, or who the important players were to help this city expand so vastly and so greatly. And really interestingly is a lot of these buildings are not existent today, or they've been modified or covered up. Now, these main ones like the Capitol and the Arch, you can still see, but the smaller buildings, and I use the word smaller loosely because a lot of these buildings are massive, but many of them have been changed, and really no description is accurately given to tell us how or why these massive buildings were built all throughout Hartford. So for the next few photographs, we're just going to take a look at some of the oldest photographs of Hartford that I could locate. These are going to be images from before World War I, and I tried to focus mainly on images from late 1800s and earlier. There will be a few images sprinkled in here from the early 1900s, but mainly I want to focus on the most unique and original buildings that stood in Hartford, as well as show you the pattern between all of these buildings and how many of the earliest had very similar architectural styles, yet they're said to have not really been related to one another in any way. So we'll focus on the buildings that are no longer existent, as well as some of the major buildings like the Capitol building and the beautiful archway. But really, I just wanted to share these images with you to hear what you think about all the different unique features of Hartford, Connecticut. The main thing that stood out to me was the angles of the top of the buildings and the turrets, and how some of the oldest buildings really appear to be constructed in the very same fashion. And it's just really interesting to me. It makes me question a little bit about what was going on back then. But either way, it's very beautiful, and I thought these images were worth sharing. So let's go through them now, and let me know anything that stands out to you down in the comments down below. So for the next couple minutes of the video, let's just focus on these oldest photographs of Hartford, Connecticut that I could find. And I'm gonna try and include the buildings that I really couldn't find a lot of information on. These are going to be unique, very large buildings that appear larger than the population could occupy. And we're just going to focus on how large and well built out this city was in the 1860s, the 1870s, and onward, and just how important of a role architecture played in this city. And another interesting fact I wanted to talk about is the ancient burying grounds of the First Church of Christ. And this is the oldest still standing church in Hartford, Connecticut. This was the first church used by the settlers when they arrived to the area. And the Book of Distribution of Land lists 163 men and women who first settled in Hartford before the year 1640, and the full list of their names is actually on a beautiful monument in these ancient burying grounds. And something interesting that I noticed in these ancient burying grounds is the tombstones from the late 1700s and the early 1800s are actually in this really weird raised design, where they were almost built as if they predicted the land around them would one day rise. Another portion of Hartford's history that I want to focus on is the late 1800s and the construction of many masonry built not only buildings, but also the beautiful bridge and the introduction of electricity to the city of Hartford. When this came to Hartford, it quickly brought the arrival of the electric tramway system or the trolley system that ran throughout Hartford and the greater Connecticut area. And I found that really interesting. Many of these systems were very advanced. I found overhead trolley systems, but also evidence of underground or conduit trolley systems that also appeared in Hartford, Connecticut. And throughout the history of Hartford, you can find many of these old world buildings were either demolished or repurposed, but there are a few that still stand in Hartford, Connecticut today. Some of the interior shots of Hartford are very revealing to the old world nature of these buildings, as well as this picture here, or this photograph, which shows a large assortment of dynamos that are said to be powering the city of Hartford, Connecticut. the next major event that the History of Hartford page discusses is a fire event that occurred in 1944, and this happened on July 6th, and they actually say it was the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, and the main tent of the circus actually caught fire, and this caused 167 casualties and injured over 700 spectators. Now, the cause of this fire, according to the narrative, was never fully determined. However, in the future, after this event occurred, there were multiple different convicts who gave confessions, but none of those were ever found to be decisive. So this is another really interesting factor that we see in a lot of old world cities. Very destructive events that seem to plague a lot of these major old world cities. After this event, and from the 1950s onward, the population of Hartford began to decline. This decline continued through the year 2000, as many of the old world buildings were demolished or lost to disrepair. In recent years, however, Hartford has experienced a revitalization and is trending in the right direction as a regrowing classic old world city with a focus on restoration of the old world buildings. And I just found that to be really interesting. I know Hartford is important to a lot of people from New England, and it's very important to the history of our country. And I never really read about the history of this land before, but I did find it to be very interesting because the photographs really say more than the history books ever could. And while the history books seem to leave large gaps, I think the photographs really show you how many of these buildings walked hand in hand with one another, and they all complemented one another, and this was a very harmonious city at one point. So I found it really fascinating, and I just wanted to share these oldest images with you. Let me know what you think about the very old world architecture of Hartford, Connecticut, and how similar these buildings are to one another. Let me know what you think about the video in general. I know there will be a few of you that are more familiar with Hartford than I am, so let me know any facts about Hartford that you'd like to share in the comments, and I will talk to you very soon on the next video. Thank you for being here.